activity, you need to find yourself an image of a disaster. When you're looking at the images, try and think about what we were talking about with movement. Even in a photograph, movement and composition are important. So in this one, this is of a bushfire, you have these vertical trunks from the trees coming up on both sides. You have diagonal lines of the road going into a disappearing point where it meets the smoke, and you have flames coming in on both directions in diagonals. Over this side there's some smoke and some curling flames that sort of bring the eye around, and on this side as well. And then it kind of comes, your eye comes back down again through the center. So it's sort of like there's this diagonal drawing your eye in, verticals drawing your eyes up, the branches and the foliage of the trees coming this way, and then your eye comes back down the center. Once I'd found my image that I liked the composition of, I printed it out, and then I got a pencil. And I just first of all looked at it really carefully to identify the main areas and lines that I could see. And so I just drew over them, those main lines that I just talked to you about. So I drew these diagonals in, drew the horizontal disappearing point, drew in the trunks to get an idea of their angles, their general sort of shape, and then just put sort of circles around the foliage areas that I felt were really directing my gaze. Fire, I started off just doing some verticals, and then I sort of traced around it to get a little bit more of an idea of the main shapes that were there. So the purpose of this was really just to identify the core structural elements of the image and to help me pare it down to simple shapes. Okay, so what I did after this was I experimented. So I'll start with this one. I went 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this was my first attempt. And what I was using, I experimented with a range of tools. So I had a little bit of brush. I used a little bit with my handmade brush. And I used a stick. And I used the top of a bit of rosemary. And that's what I got, these sort of very messy sort of lines. What I felt when I finished this one was that the textural lines have taken over the structure of the lines a little bit too much. Okay, so then my second attempt, I tried to pare back a little bit on the use of the textural lines. I still use them, however, and these parts here, I used a little bit of cardboard. So I was dragging across here to get this sort of more solid sense of space. Trying to create a little bit more contrast with the scratchy lines to the solid. I think it's a little bit more successful than the last one. And I tried again, and this time I thought I would try paring it back and using the idea of rhythm. So I did this all, drew this all with just my stick, and then right at the very end I used a little bit of the handmade brush to get these scratchy lines to be sort of the representing elements of the fire. But I used it incredibly lightly, much more lightly than I did on the first attempt or the second attempt. And this time I was using lines that were concentric, being that they're right next to each other, and I worked the ink by just redabbing and bringing it in and continuing on. Okay, so I'll show you a little bit of how I get started. So you start off with a plain piece of paper. You've got your image in front of you that you have already used to identify the main compositional elements that you're interested in. And you have that just in front of you so you can see your coffee ink. And you can also have a pot of water next to you if you want to lighten it or create a little bit of tonal variation with the ink. Okay, so when looking at the structure, we have essentially a start off with the road. Okay, and then there's one curve coming up this way, forming the land on the right, and it is joined by another piece, and ditto on the other side. Okay, coming up from this is a tree. So you just keep dipping into the ink and working the branches, flowing and twisting out. There's another one there. When it pulls like this, you need to use that to extend the lines. Okay. And there was another one here, with a bit of a branch coming out over the road. On this side, there was another one coming up here. Now, I'm not going to do the whole thing here because otherwise it'll take too long. But I'm just going to show you, all right, so that is how I kept re-dipping and dragging and using that ink. Then down here, again, keeping that, using the dipping point and the pooling of the ink, you can create some really nice effects with concentric line. You want to be creating movement. It's always about directing the eye around the page. So being mindful where you want the viewer's eye to go. And again on this side. Quite like this little like scratchy wobbly lines. They're very organic. Okay. Now with the part down the middle, actually I could even try doing the bit with the cardboard, combining a bit of the elements. So we dip it into the cardboard into the ink like this, and we just can drag it. Okay, it's quite a nice sort of effect. I identify the main sort of leaf shapes, and I'm just simplifying it down. I'm simplifying them down into representations. I'm not trying to capture all the details. And part of this sort of work is to capture movement. You need to be really working, you know, not fast, but you don't want to be too slow either, or the ink will all dry and you just, I don't know, don't get quite the fluidity that you may actually be able to capture if you move with a little bit of speed. Okay. All right. So that's my main structure. Okay, you see that? Got the road, diagonals, foreground, background bit there, fire, tree on this side, multiple trees on this side. Okay, so from there I can then start thinking about different ways of creating the sense of fire. I might choose to draw some of the fire as actual flames, or I could try using the brush, my little brush tool here, to create some sense of the movement. I've got to be careful I don't overwork the ink on this brush because it does tend to get a little bit too soggy. So with these tools you're really about working quite lightly. Not pressing hard, just going very lightly Getting some smoke up there. So using an image of a disaster, paring it down to the simplest shapes, and then using that to experiment with different ways of creating compositions of disasters using your coffee ink, your handmade tools, and a variety of different types of lines. That is your task. Okay.